All right, good morning. Thank you for coming to this session on choosing the right AI app use case for your business. My name is Naga Surendran. I'm a Senior Director of Product Marketing in the Azure team and Application Innovation. I have Nate Suris with me.
Yeah, hi everyone, Nate Series. I'm on Naga's team. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager for Cloud Native Apps, and we're happy to be here with you today.
Yeah, so we are almost the last session or the one before the last. So
yeah, thank you
for making it. So I know these are the folks really interested in AI. And I don't know about you, I could use another shot of caffeine to stay awake after 4 days of excitement and at the same time a little bit exhausting, right? So there's so much to absorb. What we will do today in the session is talk about how to choose the right AI app use case. This is really based on a lot of the implementation that Microsoft has done with our customers. In fact, you will hear from C.H. Robinson later in the session. They will talk about their journey in building the AI app use case. So you've probably seen this slide a few times, right? No surprise, generative AI is here to stay. At the same time, it's also transforming the landscape of application development. Like traditional application development is completely being changed. And we see both sort of modernizing existing applications at the same time, new apps. When you're building a new app, you will start with Gen AI, right? So if you don't, you're missing out a little bit on that. And partly the reason is really the upside and the ROI. And we see this every time we talk to customers, right? So if you look at the kind of return on investment that people are getting, it's either time savings, right? Direct cost savings. If you're thinking about support ticket resolution, that translates into direct bottom line sometimes. Things like customer satisfaction, net promoter score, that's huge. 20 points difference. That's not easy to achieve. So Gen AI is helping with that. And then if you look at the top line headline number, it's 270% ROI. That's from an IDC study that we just published a couple of weeks back. So phenomenal sort of data points coming from that. What we find that on average, while customers are realizing 3.7x return on investment, the top leaders are actually realizing 10x, even more. So when you can perfect the art of building applications with AI, the returns are even more staggering. We've also found that Gen AI usage has increased from 55% in 2023 to 75% in 2024. So this is moving at a really fast pace. So we will talk about how you can sort of get started and how we enable that. And last point, that the survey found that people are going beyond pre-built solutions, right? So that's easy. It's easy to get started with pre-built solution. You can get some value. But then when you really do custom solutions, that's when you can differentiate with your unique intellectual property. And C.H. Robinson will also talk about that a little bit later. And then if you think about sort of the key to success, just like any technology projects, is always to start with the use case and the outcome in mind rather than the technology first. Sometimes it's tempting to just start with the technology and play with it, but then you could get stuck in sort of, there is so much to explore there. So we believe sort of when you look at it broadly, the impact areas, think of internal impact for your business and then external to your customers or partners. And within that, what we've done is when we took the thousands of implementation and cataloged it, these are the 4 categories. First is how do you use AI to reshape business processes and sort of increase efficiency, right? Second, how do you use AI to enrich employee experiences? We believe the M365 Copilot or Microsoft Copilot squarely falls into the second one, but you can also do a lot of custom solutions here. And then the third is to reimagine customer experiences, whether it's personalization in terms of product selection or personalized marketing even to reach with the right content for your customers. And then lastly, using AI to accelerate product innovation and delivering new solutions to the market. So what you will hear a lot about the notion of an AI application platform. What we have done at Microsoft is brought together the full stack across application, data services, AI services, infrastructure, combined it with our developer tools, right? So so that you can go from idea to sort of production faster with the governance, security, and responsible AI and trustworthy AI principles built into it. So this is really more of, we will cover the stack a little bit more later. So let me first start with the category of reshaping business processes and what we are seeing there. It's a pretty broad area. There are a lot of scenarios here. It's obviously unique to your industry or line of business, right? But one of the common scenarios that we see is around document intelligence and summarization. No surprise, I mean, a lot of your businesses are probably dealing with documents. It could be product documentation, support cases, legal documents, financial documents like invoice processing and so on, right? Really, the use case here is to be able to connect this set of documents that you're getting at the volume of it and use natural language and AI to reason over them and also gain insights, right? So the other scenario here is around automation of business process. A lot of the times you will see a business process stitched together with documents floating from one system to another or transcribing the data from one system to another and so on. So this is really about digitization of paper-based processes or document-based processes. So a good example of this is Volvo Group. You're all familiar with Volvo. They're a leading manufacturer of trucks and buses and cars and everything else. What they were looking to do is streamline their invoice and sort of claims document processing. They used to receive them through Microsoft Outlook, and what they do is then they use a cloud connector for Office 365 to copy that over to Azure. And then they use this service called Azure AI Document Intelligence. So Azure AI Document Intelligence offers pre-built models. So sometimes when you think of AI, you can custom build a model or take a pre-built model, and that might work for your scenario. So in this case, Azure AI Document Intelligence offers pre-built models for even things like receipts, invoices, contracts, US tax forms like W-2. So it can actually identify that it's a tax form or an invoice and then extract the fields for you and give it to you in a very structured way. And that really enables the automation for you. So in this case, they even had things like handwritten notes on those invoices sometimes, and they wanted to get that out as well. So Volvo, in this case, went from 6 weeks proof of concept to production in 4 months. So that's staggering, and they ended up saving 10,000 hours over their implementation time and roughly about 1,000 hours per month. So that's tremendous sort of production, time savings here in this case. The next category is around enriching employee experiences. I talked about how Microsoft Copilot really helps in this case. But if you think about sort of custom scenarios where this might be helpful, one of the scenarios we see is knowledge mining, right? How is this different from document intelligence, right? So knowledge mining really goes broader than just documents, right? Your organizational knowledge can be in your operational databases where you are having all the transactional data, or it could be unstructured data like web interactions, who is visiting your website, or even chat conversations, call center interaction, and things like that, right? So the outcome you're looking for here is to be able to identify key patterns and insights to help the employees to be more productive. A good example is H&R Block, right? So tax filing season, we are all familiar how it can be very seasonal. There are a lot of documents and in-person conversation and phone calls. What they've done is they basically consolidated all that data into Azure Cosmos DB and given their tax professionals a copilot to be able to find that information in just seconds. And you can imagine a tax professional during the month of April, in the US at least, when you're filing taxes, every minute matters. So this is really sped up their ability to have a quality conversation with their customers as well, so that they're not spending time finding that information. It's a good example of knowledge mining. So I'll do a quick demo of how this is in action. So here you have an AI app for contract analysis. I'm going to, so if you see, it basically, you're going to use AI to look into the contract, identify any common clauses, assessing the risk. So particularly in this case, hey, there is a high risk that has been identified, and what can we do to even mitigate it, right? So, and looking at that, it also identifies potential financial liabilities and things like that, or indemnity clauses. So you can train and fine-tune the model with your data to learn from it. And lastly, you can use the AI to say, okay, can you show me other contracts with similar indemnity clauses? So I can go and see which are low risk. And you can benefit from the knowledge historically. And think about finding this without sort of AI. This can take sometimes hours, or you are asking somebody else to help you with this, and it can slow down the process. Now with AI, you are bringing up all of that knowledge in an instant with this interface. So that's an example of how that can happen. A quick architecture and how this comes together, right? So, in the case of knowledge mining, so let's assume you have a lot of documents. You can use something like Azure Logic Apps, which is sort of a workflow engine. And as the documents are coming in, you can do two things. One, use document intelligence that I talked about, extract information out of that, and also use language analytics to do translation from different languages if you want to. And then feed it into Azure Data Factory, which is sort of a data pipeline service that we offer. And use something like Azure Cosmos DB, where you can store both structured and unstructured data. And then you create vector embeddings. So you will hear this term vector search and vector embeddings. This is a new way of doing similarity search, right? Think of it as, if you go into a library and you have a favorite book, and if you want to look at what are the books that are similar, so your librarian might be helping you there. So the vector search enables you to do that kind of similarity search, so you're not doing exact search. And then you are using OpenAI here to have that conversational interface to reason over that knowledge. And then Azure AI Search is a nifty way to speed up that searches. It really creates a nice index for you. And then lastly, all of that data can be fed into Fabric, so you can do analytics, like you saw in the knowledge mining scenario, how many documents were identified as high risk or low risk, and what were mitigated, and so on. So this is a simple architecture, but gives you a lot of benefits in terms of that scenario. So with that, I'm going to have Nate come over and talk to the sort of customer impact scenarios and how you can use AI for that.
Great. Thanks, Naga. So if you remember, Naga shared that there were the two areas of impact, right? The internal focus, which he just covered. So now I'm going to talk about some of the external scenarios that we have. And so the first one is around customer experience. So think about customer service and support, personalized shopping, personalized recommendations, even things like proactive customer retention are good examples of this, this use case. So an example of personalization, right, and what this is about. So it's really about leveraging some of the new GenAI models to present personalized content. That could be recommendations based on user trends, user history, potentially providing like a conversational interface for customers. So you might, if you watch the keynote, you remember the demo maybe that Seth did, where he was looking for camping supplies, and that was a very kind of multimodal experience where it actually created personalized content for him. So some considerations for this, it's important to be able to handle all types of data because you're going to have structured data, probably in the form of customer records. You could have unstructured or semi-structured data like reviews for products, and you want to be able to handle that data and integrate it in a way that provides a more personalized experience. You also want the models to support multimodal input. That's very important. And then, of course, if you're building customer-facing solutions, being able to scale those based on demand is really critical to see value from the cloud. So a great example of this is ASOS. So ASOS is a global fashion brand. They are using GenAI to provide personalized recommendations for their customers. And one of the interesting things that they're doing is they're actually combining customer profiles and trend data. So they're actually looking at like what are the latest fashion trends, and do those potentially match some of the interests of my customers and recommend those products. So another area around external impact is product innovation. So this can mean a few things, right? It can mean adding GenAI capabilities to existing products. I think that's probably one of the most common scenarios that we see. It can also mean actually improving the product development process. So that could be prototyping, idea generation, even code generation. So even using things like GitHub Copilot to actually accelerate the development process for software. And it could also be something completely new, right, that you're building. So there's a lot of possibilities here. So one of the examples that we see is what we call build your own Copilot. So of course we have the Microsoft Copilot. There's many Copilots that exist. But if you want to create a very unique custom experience, you can actually build something that has Copilot-like capabilities. So think about an AI-powered product experience, even like a product concierge, something even like an in-car, for example, experience, which is what TomTom built. where it's a very interactive kind of interface where you can actually get recommendations. It works with the in-car's infotainment system and actually provides a much more kind of a unique experience than what was previously possible with other AI models. So this is also something that can be customer-facing. I do want to mention, we see copilots being used internally for many cases, but this is something that we see a lot of impact externally. So with this, it's important to be able to handle natural language interaction, because that's really critical to having that copilot experience. Also having the right CI/CD pipelines in place. So if you're updating this iteratively, customer-facing product, you want to be able to do that very easily. And then also being able to scale. Again, as you build a new experience, hopefully you're going to see demand increase for that, and being able to scale across apps, data, and AI services is really important. So I mentioned TomTom. So they had an in-car experience. You might be familiar with TomTom. They build GPS, maps, but they actually create systems for in-car infotainment, and they wanted to build a copilot into that. So they actually used Azure OpenAI and other services to really improve that, improve the response time, improve the relevance of the results, and really create just a better customer experience. So I'm going to show a demo of customer experience. And I mentioned the personalized shopping example. So this is an example of that. And it goes beyond just personalized shopping, because it goes into actually how you can create content dynamically that is relevant to your customer. So in this case, we have a customer that's shopping for a car, right? They might go to the web page for that car manufacturer, click on a product they're interested in. So they're going to get content that's static, typically on the page, which is fine, but it's hard to sometimes sort through that. So let's take a look at what it would be like if that content was actually personalized. So a user could log in, for example, and they could actually get content from their profile to be pulled in to use as a base for personalizing this. We could also just ask them, right, what they're interested in. This questionnaire kind of goes through some of the common things they might care about when they're buying a car. So let's say that they fill that out. Now the copy on the page is actually personalized to this customer. So it's been tailored based on what they're looking for. And other parts of the page have been personalized as well. So the statistics, right? Things they may care about in terms of range, cargo space, if they're looking for something for a family. So all of those elements of the page have actually been personalized. The customer reviews, I mentioned that's a common data type, have been summarized. So you've probably seen this a lot, in terms of different shopping sites where they now offer sort of concise summaries of the reviews, so you don't have to look through thousands of those. And then it's also even suggesting upgrades to the car that might be relevant for this customer. So that's the page copy. In the next stage, they might want to take a tour, right? Or they might want to get more of a kind of a hands-on experience. So this has actually created a video that's highlighting features of the car. And this is done actually dynamically, and it's created a video with voiceover as well. So we can't hear it, but in the actual full demo, there's a voiceover that goes with this that's highlighting features of the car. So it's really going beyond even just text and images. It's actually creating a multimodal experience. So after the post-purchase, let's say, it's also important to be able to gather feedback. So that's one of the things that Gen AI can really help with. And so in this case, we have actually an assistant that's actually calling the customer and having a conversation over voice using Gen AI. And so it's actually personalizing the responses to these questions, asking relevant follow-ups based on those answers, and gathering that information. And then it's surfacing it in a dashboard, which can be analyzed by the product team, by the marketing teams, to look for ways that they can improve the product. So this could also happen over chat. This example is again, using a voice a scenario, but there's a lot of possibilities. So I'm also going to talk about the architecture for this at a high level. So I mentioned data sources, right? So in this case, we're using enterprise data. We're using the customer data, reviews for the products. That kind of information is being pulled in. So Azure Cosmos DB is the database in this case. So that's a scalable NoSQL database. It stores vector data and the customer conversations. We're using API management to protect the API keys, to handle the authorization, authentication, and access to the APIs. We're using AKS as the app service here. So that's providing the scalable container hosting for the front end and back end services and the orchestration. Azure OpenAI service is being used to actually create the responses for that customized page. And then AI Search is storing an index of the vectorized data, and that actually helps provide more relevant responses. And then this is also using Azure Speech for the speech to text, and then another service called Azure Communication Services that actually handles the calling, right, the telephony over the phone to connect the bot with the user. So high-level architecture, we've talked about some of the use cases and some of the ways that you can implement this with examples. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the stack, right? So Naga introduced the stack earlier, and we think that there is actually a very important foundation to delivering intelligent apps or building AI apps. And part of it is technology, part of it is the use cases that we're focusing on this session. So as you think about building AI solutions for your business, it's important to think about these elements. So the use cases, right, and matching that to what is most impactful. And we'll have C.H. Robinson talk about that just shortly here. It's also important to think about the security and governance, right, across the entire lifecycle, from development to deployment to production. Being able to choose the right models, right? So you probably have seen a lot about AI Foundry here and how that helps facilitate that process. Being able to integrate into your developer workflows, right? Because you don't want developers to have to use new tools, new portals that take them out of their existing workflow. Also, the ability to be able to support different types of data and scale that. And then also another thing that we haven't mentioned before, but the ability to actually incorporate ISV solutions, right? So we have a great marketplace. We support many different ISV partners, so you can actually use a lot of the existing products and actually bring them to Azure or run them on Azure or integrate them. And we support many open standards in terms of the different products that we support. So we looked at this earlier. I'm going to quickly go through each of these layers in a bit more detail. As Naga mentioned, there's different approaches to building an AI app. You could extend Microsoft Copilot, which there's a lot of sessions that focus on that. You could build your own Copilot, which we talked a little bit about, or you can build completely new solutions. So there's a range of services to support that, and the AI services are one of the key starting points. So we talked about AI Foundry. We announced this earlier this year, or earlier this event rather, as a unified development hub, right, for your AI development. So this brings together the ability to find models, to test those, evaluate which ones work best for your use case, to bring your own data here, right, from databases, from storage, from Fabric, and then also the end-to-end management, right, to be able to host these models, to be able to govern and track them, including observability and so on. There's also the Azure AI Foundry SDK, which we announced too. So you can have developers continue to work in their environment, right, and use the SDK to interact with these services without having them to go to a new portal. We also announced the new Azure AI Agent Service as well, which makes it easier to create autonomous agents and have those be managed centrally in one place. And then there's also Azure AI Content Safety, which actually helps manage the moderation of responses and make sure that inappropriate content is not coming up in your completions or responses for customers. So that's a very important part of the stack. Next, I'm going to talk about the developer tools. So Visual Studio, GitHub, Visual Studio Code, these are all deeply integrated into the Azure ecosystem. So you get a unified developer toolchain from code to cloud. And it has built-in security into this, right? So GitHub Advanced Security has vulnerability scanning. You can automatically remediate vulnerabilities before they actually get deployed. That's very important and it actually saves a lot of developer time. And there's also a lot of the AI capabilities, right? Being able to have things like GitHub Copilot, which allow developers to focus on higher value work. So next, I'll talk about the application services. So These allow you to build and modernize any app. They support any architecture, any language. AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service, is an enterprise-grade managed Kubernetes service. Has full compatibility with the open source Kubernetes APIs. With the Azure App Service, you have an enterprise-grade service for web applications, so you can easily build and modernize and scale those. With Azure Container Apps, you have serverless containers, which provides maximum developer productivity. And then the API Services offers enterprise-wide API discovery, security, and governance. And because all of these are fully managed, they allow you to really focus on the business value, which is actually building the AI apps, right? And building these scenarios that help you focus on your business use case. So all of this is built around an open ecosystem. We have a number of partner offerings that I mentioned, and that's also an important element of the application stack. So I mentioned API management, API services. So that's an important thing to think about as you build this, because a lot of the AI services that you interact with will be APIs. So API management is a fully managed platform that offers API security and governance. And with this, you can do things like protect all of your AI model APIs. You can track usage for cost management and set limits around the usage for those services, which is very important. You can improve the response time with things like semantic caching, and you can monitor the performance of the applications as well. So the last layer, but certainly not least, is the databases, right? So these are cloud-scale databases that are built for generative AI applications. You get hyperscale performance with built-in Copilot and Azure capabilities. They support in-database vector search, which is very important to make AI application development easier, more streamlined. And you can transfer your experience using these databases. Many of you are probably using SQL, Cosmos DB, potentially, or even PostgreSQL already, and you can use that experience to leverage these databases. And this is also integrated into our analytics tools, right? So Fabric, I think Naga mentioned before. So you can actually feed that into that to provide better decision-making capabilities. If you've noticed a theme, right, we've focused on the management of these services. These are all managed services that allow you to focus more on the process of developing the application and, again, providing that business value, because you're not really getting that by managing the infrastructure or managing the actual service itself. So with that, you might be wondering, OK, you told me about a bunch of services. Sounds great, right? How can you actually get started with some of this? So we showed you some of those architectures earlier. So this is something that we've announced recently. It's called the AI Template Gallery. So this is actually a set of building blocks. Some of these are production ready. Some of them are starter repos that support some of these AI app scenarios. So these are available in different languages: .NET, Python, Java, JavaScript. So you can actually use these or have your teams use these to start prototyping AI applications. These can all be deployed in GitHub Codespaces. You can deploy them on Azure. So it's very easy to get started and play around with these and use these. And as an example, this is one for a retail chat scenario, right? So it shows you how to build a Gen AI app that pulls in enterprise data. This one is a Python example. And this was actually the base for Seth's demo in the keynote, if you remember the store experience. So this is something that you can actually use, deploy, and leverage to be kind of well on your way to production. So with that, we've talked about the services. I want to invite Naga and our guest speakers from C.H. Robinson on stage to talk a bit about how they chose their use case and what they're seeing in terms of the business impact.
Thank you, Nate.
Thanks.
Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
Ryan.
Grab a seat here, I suppose.
Great. So we talked a lot about AI application and use cases, and starting with sort of business outcomes in mind. Maybe before we jump into your particular use case, can you share a little bit more about C.H. Robinson and your roles in the company?
Yeah, so I lead our AI practice along with Ryan here. And C.H. Robinson, they're a third-party logistics provider. So what that means is we operate supply chains with technology and expertise. That involves shipping goods around the world by surface transportation with trucks and rail, steamship for forwarding and air. We're the largest surface transportation provider of truckload in North America that's a 3PL, and we're one of the key forwarders in big lanes like China to the United States. In terms of the company, we have a 120-year-old history, and we're asset light. We don't own a lot of infrastructure, so our primary product is information and technology. So when a new thing like generative AI comes around, we have to adapt, and we have the muscles to transform because it matters a lot to us. Some people might ask, why do these third-party logistic providers even exist? It's an efficiency game. The larger the freight network, the better outcomes you get. So everybody here has a supply chain, and a lot of you probably have your own private fleets, which are trucks that your company owns. What most don't realize, though, is the empty miles, where there's nothing on the truck, are quite high in that scenario. They're about 28% on average. When you get a company like us, who's a third-party logistics provider that pools the freight from 90,000 different shippers and 450,000 different carriers and truckers, okay, we're able to cut those empty miles in half. So you go down to like 10 to 15% trucks running empty. That's a 10% savings. That's a big deal. So that's why we exist. And our competitive moat, honestly, is the size of our network and our scale, because that's what drives us. So for us, we have to feed that flywheel and find ways to put low-cost freight in to be relevant and competitive. So that's kind of how we think about technology and why it matters to us.
That's great. Yeah, so I didn't know the statistic about 28% around the empty miles.
Yeah.
It's a great problem to solve. And Ryan, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit.
I'm Ryan Culligan. I do a lot of the technical architecture for the GenAI team at C.H. Robinson.
That's great. So maybe coming back to sort of the AI application use case, can you tell us a little bit about how you went about identifying what business problem to solve here? Because there's a lot that you could do with it.
Yeah, so in terms of like what we're solving, the shipment lifecycle, customers have been able to automate this about 2 years back, 2 to 3 years ago, if they're willing to integrate into us and have that expense and that complexity. So for the most technically capable shippers, they've been able to automate this life cycle of a shipment from getting a price quote to preparing the shipment for transport to managing appointments to doing in-transit tracking. The smaller shippers, though, that weren't as technically capable or really complex procedures, that kind of defied classical automation, and you couldn't reach in and do that. So you had to do it by email and have our people do the operations. So this use case was important to us because generative AI unlocked something for us. It was the ability to work with unstructured data and unstructured tasks, which had prevented this automation and why our people had to do that. When I say unstructured data, we can't make a quote with that, a price quote, right? It has to be structured like you'd fill out in a web form. Everybody's entered their birthday in, okay? You kind of do that. That's structured data. What ends up happening, though, is if someone sends you an email, they say, hey, my birthday is 2 days before Christmas. What do I possibly do with that, right? But these large language models and generative AI can put that into structure. Now, when I talk about unstructured tasks, which was the other barrier we had to overcome, that's like the shipper procedures that are varied at each facility. A common one that I've seen is, hey, could you give me insurance of $1,000 per pallet? That's not simple, right? But with these agentic flows, we give it a calculator, it goes, reaches out, computes the right insurance amount, and it just handles it. So this solution, we picked it because generative AI is able to kind of look through emails and piece together the stuff into structured data. If there's missing information, it can fill it in. It can personalize the operations. And then best of all, our people don't have to do this tactical work. That's
great. And you are even using the agentic code capabilities of LLMs to calculate things on the fly, right? So
we are.
And automate a lot of that. As you kind of talked about how GenAI is really good at, these ambiguous statements, not really structured data, and parse it out and create some structure out of that. Maybe we'll, switch it to Ryan a little bit to share how you went about building this. Where did you start? How did you sort of leverage Azure or Microsoft here services?
Yeah. So we kind of took it in 3 different steps. First was experimentation. Second was scaling, and then the third was deploying and monitoring. So when we were experimenting, we ship a lot of Xboxes and Surface tablets for Microsoft, and the team that does that works out of a shared inbox. We started by seeing if we could automate the email workflows that they were doing for proofs of delivery and other tasks that they had to do. We thought like a startup and focused narrowly on the main use case and avoided edge cases to start. From there, we started scaling out to our people. We're a COE, so we had to do a lot of training. We realized pretty early on that generative AI is really approachable. Most people can do it, and we wanted to make all of our teams tech, analytics, data science, AI enabled. So we arranged internal hackathons. We used the Azure AI templates as well as other templates for open source on GitHub, tailored them slightly to our business use cases, and did targeted trainings with people across the company to make sure that they understood how the generative AI tooling that had been emerging over the past year could apply to their business workflows and just make it tangible. From there, we started arranging sessions with Microsoft around cognitive services, Azure OpenAI, the semantic kernel team, and really just tried to show people which tools they could leverage from Microsoft, didn't have to build internally, so we could focus our use cases on logistics and not reinventing the wheel. And then when we started deploying the applications, we prioritized them by balancing business value and the ability that we had to automate the task, how complex it was. For things like email quoting and appointments, we had traditional NLP and NLU processes that were doing that previously, but they had long automation tails and just weren't flexible. They'd break frequently. Generative AI allowed us to get rid of that model lifecycle and accelerate the time that we had to market. Especially for quoting, no one wants to answer a quote at 8 p.m. on a Friday, but it's really important for the business, and it helps us get loads in the door. So after deployment, we've had things in production for about a year now. Most are running on AKS. And the most important things that we really found were we need data governance is the hardest problem for any Gen AI use case, making sure that things are grounded, that the apps are configurable by teams so they can automate those hidden factories. And just the configuration piece is something that every team needs to figure out and figure out how they can ground things. The other thing is having consistent offline and online evaluation and metrics around each application is really important, so you can work backward from the KPIs and understand when things are going wrong and when they're going right, so you can measure value. So to recap, it's a combination of people, process, and technology, and it's gone really well for us.
That's great. I think you had some really good nuggets there in terms of starting with the templates, so you're not starting from scratch. And also how Gen AI kind of unlocks for all developers, not just the group of data scientists in the previous era of AI. With that, I would maybe going back to understanding the business impact. Can you talk to that a little bit more, Mark, in terms of what it's doing for the business?
I think it's helped us in two different buckets: supply chain efficiencies overall, and then elevating our people. Okay. In terms of supply chain efficiency, speed matters. Folks are selling product they have yet to build with these just-in-time supply chains. So as much as you can accelerate the different parts coming in, you can limit working capital, but you can also recover when there's problems. Okay? Think of putting a car together. There's 30,000 parts that have to come in combination. Dealing with exceptions is a big deal. The other one is cost. When you have rush shipments, which are unplanned last minute, you can pay between 23 and 35% more per shipment based on MIT research. And so if we can get things prepared quicker for shipment, you can save a lot of money. In terms of our people, they no longer have to swivel chair between systems to go get an email, go put structured data into a quoting screen, and then go back and reply to the customer, so they can actually solve customer problems. And for us, this is a big deal. It also has helped us out with productivity. Every year, we try and increase our bottom line productivity by 15%. This has been a big enabler of that. It's allowed us to decouple business growth from headcount growth, and that's really our goal. Honestly, standing here a couple of years ago, I would never have thought we'd be able to respond to an email price quote request like this where, hey, quote me the same shipment as last week, but on Wednesday. This system can do that. So the business benefits have been huge in terms of customer savings, customer efficiency, but also our people and what they can do for our customers now.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, looking at the numbers, 30 seconds of generating a quote, and also sort of how it increases the employee well-being, so they're not spending time data entry, right? So they could focus on some higher value tasks. So that's great. Maybe just wrapping up, if you have to share with the sort of the audience, what are some best practices that you've gleaned through this exercise?
Yeah. So the first is find the expert in your company around the process you want to automate, because they'll be able to fundamentally tell you how to do this. And you can work through examples and make sure it's possible. Then think like a startup, kind of like what Ryan was saying, be quick and nimble. These are non-deterministic. You don't know the behavior until you engage them. Then the last piece is reach out for help. Microsoft was a key partner in this. We were able to bootstrap little proof of concepts to get the ideas together, but then they helped us lift that quickly onto their technology platform and scale it. So that was a big deal for us as a partnership.
Yeah. Final question, how are you scaling this going from here?
We're looking to get more depth in the multimodal images and deal with paperwork. We're also looking to set up systems to better collect tribal knowledge from our people, so we can automate deeper into the company. And that's in the form of setting up a chatbot to get instructions that the LLM can use, because what we need to do is get the procedures that you teach a person first day on the desk into the prompts, right? It knows what to do with that. So if we do that with a chatbot, we can really automate a lot more. And then forward-looking, in the next year, we're really excited for these machine use models to come out, because we can automate what's within our four walls right now, but there's a lot of shipper portals where you have to go look for an appointment or put a quote in that just don't have backends to integrate. So something that can operate a mouse and a computer the way a person could would extend this automation reach further.
That's a great example of the cutting-edge machine use models coming out, and you're ready to leverage because you are AI ready. You've done the first proof of concept and scaled it to production and achieved some really good benefits, and you're scaling it. So thank you for coming over and joining me at Ignite.
Likewise.
Mark, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. So that's a good round of applause for Mark and Ryan here for coming over and sharing the story. Very powerful story. And we see this every day. Internally, we see the success stories about 10 to 20 mails a day, right? So because the advantage with this generation of AI, as kind of Mark alluded to, or Ryan, is sort of, it empowers every developer to do it. And you saw the architectures earlier and the use cases. It's pretty easy to kind of get started with a simple use case, get some business outcome, and start to really scale. Once you get the flywheel going, you can really see some great benefits. So wrapping up here, starting with the use cases first, not the technology. It always helps. Then assess your sort of app landscape to figure out, are you going to build new? Are you going to modernize? Using the integrated AI app platform helps you go faster, leverage things like templates. And lastly, don't forget the security governance that's required to do this at scale. So ensuring that you have all the guardrails for the operations at scale. We also have a great offering called Azure Innovate. So if you work with your Microsoft team, we can do envisioning workshop with your organization, even do proof of concept. We can bring some partners, our experts into this, and all the way to production. So that's a great offer to take advantage of. And lastly, we also have a number of resources for you, whether it's trials, free services that you can experiment with and get started. There are some services that are, they have a free tier for permanently, and we have reference architectures that we talked about, templates, and skilling is an important aspect of this, right? So while you get started, you want to make sure everybody is skilled up on this technology. So we have learn modules that your teams can use. With that, these are a couple of QR codes if you want to take pictures of the AI app templates. We really encourage you to get started there, and then looking at working with your Microsoft team for the Azure Innovate offering. And that brings us to the end of the session. So thank you so much for making time on the Friday and the last day of Ignite. It was fun sharing our experience with AI apps, and thank you to the C.H. Robinson team as well for coming over to share your experience. Thanks everyone. Have a good rest of the day.